David Ettershank is the legalised cannabis MP for the Western Metropolitan Region. He sits in the upper house. How are you going, David?
I'm good, thanks, Raf. Good to be with you.
Come really close to that microphone for me. Are you crucial? Like, do the government need you? If the coalition don't support a vote in the upper house, they need you, don't they?
There's about 10 of us on the crossbench. So there's sort of traditional ways for Greens to legalise cannabis, and that gets you to 21. Otherwise, they have to pick and choose amongst the other crossbenchers.
So they can make life... You can make life easy or difficult for the government, can't you?
We can.
Yeah, okay, good. He's embracing that role. That's good. Very direct answer.
I'm on the polygraph, so I better be truthful, hadn't I?
I'll get to calls in a moment. 1300 222 774. Already some calls about being roadside drug tested when you're on medical cannabis. But just... Does it matter if the governor's a Republican?
It does have a certain sort of hunting with the hounds, running with the foxes quality. But I suppose, as a Republican myself, it's possibly slightly comforting that there's a Republican in the job. I think there was always that suspicion that John Kerr might have, gone above and beyond the call of duty when he sacked the Whitlam government. So maybe there's some comfort in in Margaret Gardner, a very prominent citizen and pretty well regarded around the town in the role.
Yes, because she still has, technically, the governor has reserve powers, could technically sack the government. So you're basically saying if she's a Republican, far less likely to maybe pull the lever on the reserve powers. Am I reading too much into your comments?
No, you're exactly right there. Okay. But mind you, I might be just being overly paranoid.
Oh, no, I got the email. I got the email during COVID about the governor should sack the premier. So that relationship died. But Kevin is calling from Keilor with the first question to David Ettershank. What do you want to ask him, Kevin?
Yeah, hi, David. Just a question about how that bill's progressing in regards to the roadside testing for cannabis.
Yeah, it's a very good question. We're quite keen to know ourselves. We've had negotiations with the government. We've put some proposals to the government about a trial to basically put to bed this
is
myth.
People on medical cannabis getting tested positive on a roadside drug test for illicit cannabis.
Correct. Yeah. And of course, very often by the nature of how cannabis is in the body, a person may have consumed that cannabis weeks before.
Yeah. What have the government said, because they're sort of open to it, what have they specifically said they might do? Anything?
We've had, I think the expression they use in political world is productive discussions.
Okay. Are you in the conversation?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
Are they productive?
To date, they've been sort of a bit more one way than one might have liked. We've sort of said what we want and they've nodded and taken notes and said, yes, this is very positive and we'll work through it. Our understanding is that's pretty advanced. We know that there's been 4 departments that have been working on it, and I think the other day Shane Patton made some comments, Commissioner Patton made some comments about the wheels of government were turning on this question. And of course the Premier's said 3 times now that this is a high priority to resolve.
You're counting. Timeline?
We believe we'll have some news in the next few weeks.
Oh, okay. Next few weeks.
That's my understanding.
Any idea what that news might be?
I would hope that it is that there'll be a trial for medicinal cannabis consumers to be able to drive, and that there'll be an evaluative framework
as in stand on one leg. Well, I just wonder, because that's the obstacle, isn't it? The police want to be able to work out whether or not you're impaired. Is that the obstacle or not?
It's not really, because the police actually do have a standard field impairment test that they can use. The trouble is, I think, and I don't want to speak poorly of our police, who I know do a sterling job, but I think in the last 3 years there's been something like 13,000 people booked for presence for having it in their blood, compared to I think it's 135 for impairment.
Oh, what's the impairment test? I actually didn't know there was an impairment test. What do they get you to do?
Exactly like you see in the movies, basically.
Really?
Stand on one foot and touch your nose. Right. What's the date? Those sort of basic tests. Right. And then if you fail that, then, like in Canada, you actually do that roadside test first before they would swab you. Oh, okay. Whereas here we do it the other way around.
Okay, so we might get some news on that in a few weeks' time, maybe. Hard to know.
We are hopeful.
Okay, great. I'm glad you asked that, Kevin. I was going to get to that. 1300 222 774 is the phone number. Where do we start? Gambling ads. What do you want to ban?
We wanted to ban the static ads at places like the MCG. Obviously, broadcast is covered by the federal government, but it's at both a sort of subconscious as well as a very overt level, that sort of saturation gambling ads you see at the footy sort of circumvent the intent.
Yes.
And so, very simple, we simply moved an amendment when there was the gambling reform amendment in last week's parliament, which would have banned static ads.
And?
The government and the opposition joined together to vote against us.
Any hope of getting that going anywhere else in any other way?
Oh, we never give up,
Right.
Raf, never give up. We'll just wait for the next opportunity and push forward. And I think it's really important that the community expresses to the politicians that this is an issue they take seriously and they want to see action to remove what's really an epidemic of advertising, saturation advertising on gambling.
Did either the government or the opposition say things that made you feel they might be more sympathetic next time?
Nope.
Right, so you don't think that's going to happen with either of the major parties?
I didn't actually get into conversation much about their motives, but certainly we were very disappointed that it wasn't taken seriously by those two parties. And I guess we take an opportunity like now to just say, think again. People have certain expectations and it's not just about the money.
What do you mean by expectations and not about the money?
I think there's a general feeling within the community that advertising on gambling is beyond saturation point.
Yeah.
And it sort of looks like the tail wagging the dog with the advertisers just doing pretty much what they like. And it's time that we curtailed that. It's the same with, I think we've tried to get a bit of action on some of the ways in which the poker machine operators circumvent shutdown periods.
Oh, they have the venues on rolling shutdown, so addicts have always got a place that's open they can go to.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And, it's obviously a contrived arrangement, so we're very keen and we've put to the Minister fairly forcefully that, you should be making legislative changes or regulatory changes to avoid this flagrant circumnavigation of the law.
David Ettershank is with us, the legalised cannabis MP for the Western Metropolitan Region. So you might not know, it's 5, isn't it? Yes, 5 MPs in each region. The state is divided up into regions.
Correct.
The city's divided up and then there's regional regions as well. 1300 222 774. I'll get to more of your questions. One thing I just wanted to clarify. Your proposal to get rid of the static advertising, the billboards at... I've not been to Cardinia Park, and forgive me, I haven't watched the Geelong game. But the billboards at Docklands and the MCG, there's a ton of them, and you can very clearly see them on television. You're talking about those electronic ads that sometimes are gambling ads. You're talking about banning that, aren't you?
Correct.
What are the
and
AFL?
sometimes you'll see it also while the decision's pending. There'll be a sports bet ad up there, all of which is clearly not consistent with the intent of harm minimisation.
What have the AFL said to you? Have you spoken to them about those ads?
No, we haven't. No.
Spoken to Docklands or the MCC about that?
No, but it's a damn good suggestion.
Don't know, I wonder how they'd. I wonder how they would. I wonder how they would respond to you. Just back on the legalisation. Sorry, not legalisation. Well, I guess it's a bit in the name of your party, legalise cannabis. The trial's not going to be for recreational drug users, is it? So the trial for the roadside testing is only for medicinal cannabis, correct?
Correct.
What's the general platform? Are you about legalising for medicinal cannabis or are you about legalising a range of illicit drugs? What's the party's platform?
It's pretty much the labels on the tin, as they say. So we are seeking legalisation. But
just of cannabis or of other things?
No, primarily of cannabis, yes.
Right, okay.
Absolutely.
I mean, so not psilocybin, acid, MDMA, ecstasy. I'm just wondering.
No. It's a good question. And look, there is an important broader issue about harm minimisation, which encompasses those other drugs. And we're seeing some interesting things happening in all places, Queensland.
Yeah.
Where there's actually some legal changes happening there. But in terms of what we're focused on primarily, it's the appropriate regulation of cannabis. And I use that expression regulation because there's a lot of confusion and you get into this semantic swamp when you talk about decriminalisation versus legalisation.
What's your ideal though? Because a lot of the states in the United States thrown open the gates. If the alcohol and tobacco industries want to get into selling marijuana, go for it. You know, is that sort of your ideal end state, or have you got another ideal end state in mind?
I think it's something where we need to work through an Australian solution.
Okay.
There was some pretty well worked up stuff in New Zealand. I think that we should look at. There's some very well worked up stuff in Canada and in Europe and in some of the American states.
That's a bit less not letting the free market rip, but not getting any criminalisation of the production and the possession.
Correct. So it's not that laissez-faire, just open the doors.
Yes.
You know, we think it should be regulated. You need to make sure that there's appropriate harm minimisation and education as part of that process.
I'll get to calls. I'll get to your texts as well. David Ettershank is with us. He's one of the 2 legalised cannabis MPs for the Western Metropolitan region. The government often goes to the Greens and then 2 votes from a party like legalised cannabis to get its legislation through. It's more policy aligned, perhaps, with David Ettershank than it is with others in the upper house. Anthony's calling from Kensington. Anthony, what do you want to mention?
Hi, Raf. How are you?
I'm good. Go for it.
I've got a question for David. I'll cut to the chase. I'm a THC client, THC, and but they're not approving CBD oil at the moment. Can I use it because I'll sit by a car? That's why I'm a THC client. Got a whole bunch of people with quadriplegia. They receive high blood pressure, and so that's what I received with my disability.
So you use the cannabis oil to control your blood pressure, and your quadriplegics are your TAC client, correct?
Yes, exactly. Right. That's right, Raf.
So what's the query?
I'm wondering whether when in Parliament, if the TAC will accept, will reimburse me up when I pay for it for my disability.
How much are you paying, like a month or a week, for your cannabis oil?
It's 170 for 30 mils, so I use it for once a month.
Okay, 170 a month.
I buy it once a month, and it's 30 mils.
Understood. Look, hang on a sec, Anthony. David Ettershank, is TAC going to pick one up like that, do you think?
Look, it's a really good question. We've had so many complaints from people covered by the TAC and also by work cover about being rejected or having specific conditions that aren't necessarily logic and a real lack of consistency. And we actually had a meeting with Danny Pearson, who's the Minister covering both TAC and work cover, just last week actually, and we raised a number of these issues with him, and we're awaiting eaggerly his response.
Because they're legal products, so work cover and TAC often don't cover medical cannabis bills.
That's correct, and that's the big issue. I mean, it's also the issue at the heart of the medicinal cannabis driving,
right?
Which is, if it's a medicine, and this government made it a medicine, then treat it like a medicine and don't discriminate against these people who are using cannabis-based products.
Sure.
Because you don't do it with opioids, you don't do it with benzodiazepines, you don't do it with any of these other drugs. Why just cannabis patients? And it's a hangover.
For Anthony, do you have a timeline on when you're going to get an answer from Danny Pearson? It's okay if you don't, but I know. No, okay.
Love to, but we'll certainly not be keeping it a secret. Let's put it that way.
Anthony, thank you for your questions. It's great to know the issues that are floating around and that are clearly so important for so many. David, just before I ask you some more policy questions, I do want to get onto the potential planning changes that might increase housing supply, but this question's kind of central. Why, with one or a handful of seats, do you believe your group hold a moral compass on the majority rest of us who didn't vote for you?
Oh, geez, that's a good question, isn't it? I guess it's called a democracy. You know, we got about 5% of the vote. We got exactly 5% of the seats. So in terms of proportional representation, it's pretty much spot on.
Do you take it as a different responsibility, though? Because you're often the swing vote. Government can rely on the Greens in some issues. They probably then come to you. You are effectively the kingmaker. Do you think about it any differently because of that?
I guess this may sound a bit wussy, but I guess we've been there for 6 months and we're still in very steep learning curve. Mm-hmm. It's been very rare that we are in that position because normally there are other votes floating around. And of course, sure, on the majority of things that go before the floor, it's just between the government and the opposition. So it just goes through on the voices. Mm-hmm. So it is...
You're going to get your pandemic legislation, though. That day will come. That was very controversial. Have you thought about that?
Yes, and we did have that to some degree when we were talking about the Lawyer X stuff, which was pretty full on, and also there was the information sharing bill.
Yes.
So, and in both of those, we required, I think, good and sensible amendments from the government for our support. And all you can do, if this is what the Democratic vote has thrown out, well, it is what it is, and we will just do what we think is best and progressive and appropriate for the citizens of Victoria and for our constituency.
How did you get into politics?
Accident.
Tell me what happened.
Look, I just got a phone call a couple of weeks before the election saying, would you be okay to take a phone call from Legalised Cannabis? They're looking for candidates, and you're into local politics and you're into cannabis. Do you want to take a call? So I took a call, and 2 weeks later I was standing at the front of the Footscray Early Voting Centre with a core flute and handing out how to vote. It was literally that. I've been involved in community politics and union politics for 40 years, but I've never sought
can I ask which union?
Multiples actually. I worked for the Trade Union Training Authority for a long time, the Liquor Trades Union. I worked for the Labor Council.
So you worked for them?
Correct.
Right. When you're working for a union, what sort of things do you do?
Well, I was generally either an industrial officer or an education officer.
Yeah, right.
And the industrial officer was sort of paralegal, and the education officer, which was my favourite, was just getting out there and training up people how to fight for their rights.
What's the biggest surprise so far, being an MP?
Oh, how hard you have to work. It's really hard work. And there's just an immense amount you have to take in and process. And I guess, on the one side, this balance of power notion is very sort of, oh, gee whiz. But the other one, of course, the flip side of that is you've got to be across everything that comes through the floor. You can't sort of not be there or not be present. And I guess Rachel Payne, my colleague, and I feel an obligation to also declare clearly where we stand on issues and why.
The moves to increase the amount of houses we have, this is me totally reading between the lines, it looks to me like the state government is going to strip some planning powers from councils to allow smaller developments. I presume that will allow people to subdivide, build a few units on their homes. That's 100% me guessing. I've been trying to find out what's going on. Is it in general a good idea to take some of those planning controls away from council to increase the number of homes we have in established suburbs?
Again, like yourself, knowing very little about what's being proposed and putting that caveat, I guess my answer would be no. And the reason for that is that the state government already has very significant powers to shape planning, and that varies from simply overriding planning schemes and stuff like that through to intervening in particular planning applications.
They can pull the big ones in, can't they?
They can. Well, they don't actually have to be that big, Raf. No. I think it's about 1,500 square metres, which might be 3 or 4 stories, and we see that. I mean, I live in Kensington, where there's multiple developments have been going through for the last couple of decades, and we've fought a lot of rearguard actions. And I think it's very convenient to shoot council. And I think the flip side of this is that people have seen a lot of very, very poor outcomes out of planning. And one of the few democratic safeguards they have is the right to appeal. So I would think that before the government took away those powers, they would want to be very honest in their conversation with the community about what they're going to replace it with and how this will result in better planning outcomes.
And final question for you. I'll get some news headlines in a moment. I'm grateful you're tripping through all these subjects. I know you got an inquiry into the hemp industry through with most politicians in the parliament supporting it. Is it genuinely a possibility that however many hundreds of people are employed in native timber logging, could they seriously be employed in the hemp industry, do you think?
If you look at Canada, Australia and Canada in 98 both made the decisions to allow for industrial hemp growing, to push back a little bit of the prohibition.
Yep.
So we both started about the same time. Canada sort of promoted the industry a bit. Australia generally did bugger all. And That industry in Canada is now worth about $500 million a year, and they anticipate it'll be worth about $5 billion by 2030.
Right.
The international industry is worth about $27 billion. In Australia, it's tens of millions max. It won't be something you can just switch over, but certainly it's a great crop. It's very supportive for cellulosic fibre, which is pulp and paper replacement. And so it would then be about developing an industry plan and both growing more hemp and also being able to process it here.
Yes.
And that's where the value adds are, and that's where the jobs are in places like Maryvale and Haywood. So we're just saying at this point in time, let's do a proper inquiry and work out, is it viable? And how do we capitalise on this thing, which is basically currently a sort of drive-by shooting victim of the prohibition on cannabis?
Thank you very much for your time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Medicinal cannabis, maybe. David Ettershank had a chat to the relevant minister about that recently. And as best he can tell, that issue around roadside drug testing, whether or not people with medicinal cannabis could do something like show a prescription and pass an impairment test, his best guess is maybe there's a result on that in the next 2-3 weeks. We will see. Maybe it takes a couple of months, but he used the word weeks, not months. We will see. Won't hold him to that, but at least he's on the inside of the machine giving you some insight. I'll get to your texts and calls as well.